on my end.
And then when should we?
Right now is a good time. It looks like so I'm good here. I'm not picking up my mic. My headphones aren't picking up on my mic, which is nice.
Okay, and I'll hit record. All right.
All right, everybody, you recording? We're all good?
Yep.
Cool. Oh, and one more thing that I should mention now. Anybody's cameras cut out at any point. I did that. It means that just that the internet's like lagging a little bit, and so it'll make it's easier to have conversations with the cameras on. But if the thing starts like lagging or anything, I'll cut cameras. But
okay,
anybody dropped out. Yeah, I had that happen in the last interview that I just did, and I didn't tell anybody beforehand, and I cut cameras. So okay, cool. So where do I want to start? All right. So the first thing that I want to start with, my go-to question for any show that has more than one host is to ask how you guys met. Like, I think that's where we'll start.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Well, I met Carrie in 2008 because she was my professor at Arizona State University. I guess we didn't technically meet. I just stared at you mostly. I learned from you.
Yeah, that's right. We didn't talk that much, but yeah, we technically met then. She was actually in my very first class at Arizona State.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. You had just moved to the US too.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right after.
So how did the conversation for starting the podcast, as far as like deciding what the topic was going to be, to figuring out was going to go, and we'll kind of get more into the nitty gritty of all of that as we go. But I just want to start out with kind of how the idea for the podcast came around.
Well, so I've been thinking about what I wanted to do. So as a linguist, I've always wanted to spread the word about how important language is and how important it is not to judge people for how we speak. And I'd given a TEDx talk about it in Chandler, Arizona, a couple of years ago. And I realized, I think maybe I should write a book about that. So that was my first thought. And then I thought, well, I don't really have a platform. How am I going to shop this book? And then I realized actually maybe starting a podcast about the topic of linguistic discrimination would be the way to go. And I thought, I can't do it on my own. It'll be boring if it's just me. So I thought, I know Megan really is interested in this topic as well. And so I asked her, hey, you want to be a co-host on this podcast? And she said yes. And so then we started brainstorming from there, like what kind of topics do we want to talk about? And obviously Vocal Fry was one of the first things that came to our minds because women are constantly judged for it. And so that's sort of how the name for our podcast arose. We were bandying the name around, like, what's a good pun with Vocal Fry? And then, it just sort of grew out of there.
Yeah, and I was actually in the audience of the TEDx talk, and I've mentioned it on our podcast, but I was amazed at how amazed everyone was in the audience about what they were hearing. They really just did not know that linguistic discrimination was a thing that existed, or potentially that they were doing. You know, there were some light bulbs for sure where it looked like maybe they had realized that they had been doing something their entire lives, probably.
So let's jump in. Let's jump right into that topic. Can you kind of explain? I mean, I know since there's you guys are doing a whole podcast about it. It's a big topic, but kind of like the condensed version, I guess, of sort of that term means, that linguistic discrimination.
So it's discriminating against people for the way that they talk, for the language that they talk, for the dialect that they use, for the accent that they have, for any feature of language that you might use.
Right.
You can be judged for it.
Right. And it could be physical as well. You could have a lisp, right? Judging people for having a lisp, judging people for having, what else? What other kind of physical or things that you might not think of automatically with linguistic discrimination?
Well, you might discriminate against someone for being deaf or hard of hearing. So they're
Right.
signing instead of speaking. And there is a lot of judgment about that.
Right.
So I think you know, I hear that, and I think to myself, because I listen to the show and I try to think, you know, have I ever done something like that? And I'm sure, you know, we all like to think, no, not me, I've never done that. I think I have been the victim of it within my own family. I grew up kind of removed from a part of my family that was Mexican. But because I didn't grow up around that part of the family, you know, I don't speak Spanish. And because very white and my mom is half white, I don't look like that side of the family. Sometimes I feel like kind of a bit of an outcast among them. I definitely understand the concept. I get the idea of it and the feeling of it.
Oh yeah. One of our episodes we did on Chicano English, we talk about how there's a lot of Mexican Americans that don't speak Spanish. There's like an in-group tension between can you still be Chicano or Mexican American if you don't speak Spanish? I don't speak Spanish and I'm Chicana, and I grew up with my Mexican American family. So I don't feel like an outcast that way, but I definitely feel like an outcast because I don't speak Spanish still. And that's like me internalizing linguistic discrimination, just the way that you seem to have as well with not speaking Spanish.
Mm-hmm. That is at my high school days, something that I kind of regret not taking. I took German and to be
well, you never know. Like you could have ended up in Germany.
Well, I did an exchange program, so it was useful for like those like but it hasn't been since.
Yeah.
But it's always good to learn more languages. You learn more about cultures. We have this terrible what's the terrible joke? What do you call someone who speaks two languages bilingual? Someone who speaks one language American? Right? So it's like, for some reason in America, we have different value systems around speaking multiple languages and who speaks them. So we prefer certain groups to speak multiple languages and other groups not to.
Yeah, that was something that I noticed when I was to go to Germany. You know, I would I would be in like a shop and I would ask for something, and they could tell that my German was not super great, and so they'd get really excited because they'd get an opportunity to practice English. And I'm like, no, please, here to learn, not to be comfortable. But it's that weird thing where I think you know, like you're saying, Americans tend to speak one language. So you come here from another country speaking that language, you're at a disadvantage. But it seems like you can kind of go most places with English and be pretty okay.
Yeah, there's usually at least one person somewhere who knows English.
Yes, thanks colonialism.
Yeah. I mean, that's the same with Spanish, right? There's a lot of countries where you can use Spanish, again, result of colonialism. French as well.
So I want to shift over to I want to ask about because I know within different contexts words mean different things. And the term linguist itself, I find really interesting because the reason that I say different contexts, you know, when I was in the military, that's what I had enlisted, which all that meant was translator. I'm just curious as to in your context what that term means.
Yeah, it has, well, at least I guess at least three meanings within sort of the American context. There's the translator, the linguist that works for the army or whatever. There's the polyglot, so a person who speaks multiple languages. And then there's the meaning that academic linguists mean, which is people who study the structure of language. And that could be so many different things, right? We can study the sounds, we can study the words, how they're built, we can study the syntax or grammar, we can study the meaning of things. We can study the sociological factors for language. There's psycholinguistics. I mean, there's just lots of different things within that field, but it's all about just studying language. And so you may or may not speak another language. I used to speak French badly, and I learned enough Squamish, which is an Indigenous language spoken in Canada, to have very short conversations, but I just don't have reason to use it here. So I'm functionally a monolingual again.
Yeah. And sorry. No, I'm definitely a linguist of the scientific sort, but I have taken enough Spanish where I can get by, but of course it would have been easier if my dad taught me. But again, there's tons of reasons why, and we talk about it on the pod, but yeah. So I say I speak 1.5 languages.
Oh yeah, and actually there's another meaning of the word linguist which came up in our the last episode we just recorded, which will come out in a few weeks, but it was about Ghanaian English and other Ghanaian languages. And in Ghana, linguist can mean something more like the person who explains what the chief wants. Is that the right way to say it?
Kind of like a spokesperson.
Yeah, the chief spokesperson is the linguist, which I find so fascinating.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
I know I think talking about speaking of a language, I think that is one of the kind of tragic things about languages. It feels like it is definitely one of those skills where if you don't use it, you lose it. My German used to be really on point, and then I started learning Arabic, and then my German started slipping, and now I don't speak Arabic either. So I speak like again, like, yeah, just like I said, enough to get by, maybe. But yeah, that's the weird thing about that kind of skill. It's definitely not like they say riding a bike. It's not the same at all.
It's definitely a trickier skill than riding a bike. Yeah, because there's way more moving parts with the language, right? Like, not only is there the vocabulary or the grammar and all that stuff, there's also all the sociological factors that you have to consider. Are you using the correct form in front of this person? Are you being rude? Etc. So
I mean, I would have never known that I couldn't say the word tabernacle in French Canada. Like, these are things you learn by growing up there or speaking.
Again, I think you can, but if you use it as a swear word, like if you just say it as tabernacle, that's a swear word. But if you were to talk about the tabernacle as whatever. Remember, it's like I think it's the building, something to do with the church. We don't know.
We never know, but that seems to be what I always go back to. But yeah, like in idioms, like kick the bucket, that's not something that you just, you have to learn those nuances too when you're learning another language. Oh,
absolutely. I know a great example of that, and this is why I think I wish that these programs were easier to get into. I very much lucked into the kind of financial situation to be able to do an exchange program. I thought ahead enough from when I was born to start putting away money every year for my birthday, so that when I got old enough to need a large sum of money at some point, I would be able to use it. So I lucked out there. But I, learned all sorts of things that I wouldn't have learned in the class. About how, like, one good example that I always like to give is when I was in Germany with my host family, they would say something, and if I didn't understand it, I would say the only word that was available to me at the time, which was was, what, and apparently extremely rude. Always correct me, and it took a while still for me to kind of get what I'm supposed to be saying instead of just what I have available to me at the time. Kind of what makes me so sad that I'm kind of starting to lose that language. So I'm trying to get back into consuming like media and things like that would have that, so that I can kind of start to refresh that.
Yeah, that's a good way, at least, to keep it somewhat in your mind, is to watch a German television show or something, read a book in German. It's hard work, but at least it refreshes the neurons a little.
Right. I mean, the best is always going to be interacting with someone else,
of course.
But yeah.
Which if I hadn't picked such a niche language, that might be doable. But as it stands, it's probably going to be just and that's the other thing that I'm trying to figure out, whether or not I even want to continue to try to learn. It's like it's a neat skill, but it's not necessarily I guess aside from being able to say I speak 2 languages, but other than that, I can't. A good use for it. But I'm going off on a tangent. I want to shift the conversation back to the show. And I kind of wanted to ask you guys how you go about picking topics for episodes. I know like they're the kind of episodes that you guys have covered have covered so far a pretty large different kind of languages, and so I'm just curious how you go about deciding topics first. Well,
it depends, I guess. Sometimes someone comes up to us and says, hey, actually, I want to be on your show. I have a topic that needs to be discussed. So for example, Rachel Tatman, who wanted to talk about automatic speech recognition, she came to us. But often we'll have an idea, we'll say to the other person, hey, do you think it'd be a good idea to talk about this? So for example, we wanted to talk about Black English at some point. And so I have a friend who works in rhetoric. So she's not a linguist, and we wanted to talk to her. So hopefully she'll be coming up in a month or two. But yeah, so it's just back and forth.
Yeah, it's just a little nepotism with people that we know. But we usually. But I mean, the linguistic community is small, but we have we specifically don't just want linguists. Because the thing about language is how universal it is, whether we use our hands or our mouth, it's universal. So, we had a award-winning poet as one of our guests. I'm sure we will have many more that aren't linguists as well, but it's good to have non-linguists sometimes, because they aren't using jargon that we always have to stop and think about.
Yeah, because we have so much jargon. I mean, every scientific field does, but we forget because we're just so used to it. So, I can talk about creaky voice or instead of vocal fry. That creaky voice is sort of the more linguistic jargony way of saying it, but that's not how people think about it, and it's not really all that helpful. So,
right. Yeah, and it kind of just depends on what's happening in the news too. We're going to do an interview on trans language this week, and it's because it's becoming much more at the forefront of everyone's minds because of media. So, and it's very important.
I also want to point out that everybody probably has judged someone else's language, and probably almost everyone has been judged for their language. So it really does. It is a universal experience, linguistic discrimination. And I think that's why we really want to tackle as many different topics as we can, just to show, hey, actually, this does impact you. And maybe that's why you shouldn't do it to someone else in this case.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, before I stumbled across the show, it was definitely, I'd never really given any real thought to. Said it's something that likely affects everybody, but I think it's something that maybe a lot of people don't, unless you're talking like really overt stuff. I think it's something that maybe like a lot of people don't necessarily realize is happening per se. I don't know a good way to phrase that.
No, absolutely. It's very under the surface. We're basically taught to be discriminatory with language. We are taught, hey, if you use double negatives, that makes you stupid. Yeah. And that's really unfair and untrue.
Yeah. I mean, in our English courses, we're taught, right? I don't know, what our episode 4 or something, when we did grammar Nazis, that's the one that most people are, honestly. And did you like know that you're actually like it's discriminating against someone for the way that they write? Or, you know, if they don't know the difference between your and your, it could actually just be like a proxy for discriminating against people with dyslexia who have trouble, you know, with letters, seeing letters, or people of different classes because they don't have access to, you know, the education where they keep practicing these things, because it's a practice to get, you know, the different yours down.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's I am definitely guilty of that one.
Oh yeah,
we all are.
Me too. Yeah,
I was for a long time. It wasn't until I really started doing linguistics that I realized how douchey that is.
Yeah. Well, and with the rise of text messaging and social media, I realized, I was like, oh my God, look at all these people that I care about that don't know the difference between your, you know, I'm like, it's so artificial that I was judging people on this anyway, as some sort of like measure of their goodness, you know? So thankfully actually text messages have helped me be less of an asshole too.
That's actually what's kind of funny about that at the same time is that is catching slip-ups on grammar is something that I try to limit to the house now, in that very in a joking sort of way are very on each other's grammar. Any kind of little slip-ups, and we definitely give each other a good amount of shit for it.
Yeah.
But it's more loving, so it's not being an asshole in that case.
Well, I used to do it with my partner too, but now if he ever corrects me on anything, I'm just like, I need you to listen to episode whatever, or like, you're gonna need to listen to that again.
So, after a topic has been decided on, I'm curious how you go about reaching out to show, finding those guests in the first place, and then just kind of how that part of the process looks.
Social media. Twitter has been very helpful. I think, I don't know about you, Carrie, I think you've emailed more people, but the people that I have got for the show has all been through Twitter.
Yeah, you're younger than me, so you use Twitter more natively than I do. I definitely email more people, or Facebook. I mean, it kind of depends on who it is and how close we are, but
yeah.
And
so far, I haven't had anyone turn me down. So
same.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's a matter of if you're comfortable with it or not. We're not gonna, you know, we're nice and we're not gonna do anything terrible to you. And our producer is gonna make you sound great. So, yeah.
And also we want our guests to feel comfortable. So we'll say like, what are the topics that you want us to talk about? And also if they really are worried, we'll send them the list of questions that we think we'll talk about. And, you know, we're never going to get into anything super personal unless they want to. Mm-hmm. So like Tito Rios, he got into some really personal stuff, but that was totally on his, that's what he wanted to talk about. And it was amazing. That was one of my favorite episodes.
Yeah, I think it is my favorite episode. I mean, he's a poet, so he like bleeds emotions.
It's true.
So yeah, but mostly it's a really easy process. The biggest thing is getting a date for everyone.
Yeah,
but, you know,
and time zones sometimes.
Yeah,
we
I mess them up.
I get that. That's the worst part of all of that stuff. I plenty of times where the big difficulties with scheduling is like for instance with this show, I've got and Sundays, and that's it. I work nights, so I have a weird schedule already, and then compound that with a Monday through Friday nights. So it's not even like where if I had a normal, you know, schedule that normal human beings keep, I would be able to say, well, if you can't make it on the weekend, we could come in during the week in the evening sometime. Nope.
Right.
when everybody else is normally available, which definitely makes it a little difficult. So I totally get it with that, the idea of scheduling being not fun.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, as far as so we've gone from we've decided the topic, we've got the guests, be in the other order, but I'm curious what the research for a topic looks like after that.
I guess
Be prepared for the episode.
it depends on the topic and how much we already know about it. So, for example, with the Vocal Fry episode, it was also our first episode, so I think we over prepared because we just didn't know.
Yes.
And then, I learned a lot about Vocal Fry because I really didn't know that much about it. My training is in syntax and semantics, so grammar and meaning. And here we were talking about something like pure phonetics, like pure sound. And I just felt like I wanted to be able to describe it properly without being confusing. So I spent a lot of time on that one. But our last episode about that we just recorded about Ghana English, I mean, I know nothing, but I thought this guy is the expert and he really knows all these topics. So I will just let him explain it to us. Yeah. So it really depends. Do we have a guest? If we have a guest, we're probably going to do less research. Do we know anything about it, and how much do we know about it?
And a good another point about that is that since we're doing linguistic discrimination, the reason why we did Vocal Fry and we also did swearing without guests is because we do those things. But we don't want to talk about issues that are personal to people that aren't part of our linguistic identity. So there's no way that just me and Carrie could have talked about Ghanaian English, right? That would have been insulting to pretend to for this guy to come on and us to be like, are you sure that's the way it is? Like, it's just, so it's better just to let him tell us and us be amazed. Like, I learned the entire time he was talking, everything was just like a learning experience. So it's really awesome. But yeah, again, we don't want to linguist-splain anything to any of our guests. So we let them teach us. Yeah.
So I'm curious about within that kind of the wide range of topics that this sort of thing can cover. I know within like every sort of interest that that people have in any kind of field, like I'm trying to think of how to word this properly. I guess like specific topics that people really like geek out on, or super like focus, like they could talk for hours about a certain little topic. If you guys have anything like that, and what it would be, I guess.
Yeah. Carrie?
Well, okay, you go ahead.
Yeah. If we're talking about like really linguistic-y stuff that's probably really geeky that no one cares about besides linguists, my thing would be the past tense in English. I'm really obsessed with it. For whatever reason, I could talk about it forever. I really love that kids say I braked something instead of I broke it. I do child language acquisition, so that's one of the reasons too. But if we're talking about linguistic discrimination in particular, I'm very much could talk forever about Chicano English or the Spanish and English situation in the borderlands down here in Arizona. So
yeah, for me, most of my linguistic interests have been indigenous languages of North America, and within that it has been the noun phrase. So I'm interested in how noun phrases are built in indigenous languages throughout the continent, mostly Canadian, but I have worked on American languages as well, and one language that straddles the border between the United States and Mexico, called Quechan. So what I'm really interested in is, so in English you add the to create a full noun phrase, so that the cat becomes a full noun phrase, but cat by itself is just not enough. And some languages cat's enough, and some languages you need something else. And so all this we call functional superstructure. I could go on about that forever. I could talk about how there's different kinds of plurals and all kinds of stuff like that. Linguistic discrimination side, I mean, I guess it would go back to the indigenous stuff, because there's so much discrimination against Native Americans in the United States or Indigenous peoples in Canada. And that goes along with what language they use, which variety of English they use, if they're speaking their own language, how people think that Indigenous languages don't have real grammar, and on and on and on and on. And it's pure racism. And yeah, that's my flag.
And that's even if they're talking about them at all, right? Like mostly there's erasure. So it's like,
well, especially in the United States. So that was one thing that really shocked me when I moved here. So in Canada, there was this huge truth and reconciliation process that went on after I left, but there's certainly been talk about, hey, there's actually been some cultural genocide here for a while. We talked about it for a while before I moved to the States. And then when I got to the States, there was almost no discussion at all. You know, like TV shows, people will say, oh, the Chumash people were blah, blah, blah. No, the Chumash people are. They still very much exist. So, yeah. Yeah,
I think that idea of sort of acknowledging the past in that context, I'm noticing is something that's coming up a lot more. Like I'm noticing more and more states are finally starting to take the move to go, hey, maybe Columbus Day is a little bit messed up.
Yeah.
Maybe not the best thing that we did. And getting the pushback on that kind of stuff is something that I guess I think we all kind of tend to insulate ourselves. And so like I'm trying to do that less. But there are certain things that I still like struggle with understanding, like something like that, where you hear people go like, that's why we're getting rid of history. Is that what we're doing? Well, no, but I can't fathom like action to Columbus Day that makes you so offended.
Well, there is an answer to that. It's whiteness.
Yeah.
And Columbus Day was created so that Italians could be included as white people, basically. It was, I only learned this very recently, that it was a way to like to give Italian Americans something special. But he was a nightmare. He was a horrible human being.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. There's no like but in that statement. Like he's just a horrible human being, period. Yeah.
I notice that's interesting that you mentioned that that it was to kind of include Italians in the purview of whiteness. That is an interesting topic that I've been sort of starting to learn more about, is the history, the term white, and how I think it's interesting that we're seeing, you know, and I don't want to get too in the weeds on politics, because I have a feeling we all align here, and that kind of gets boring.
Fair enough.
but I'm noticing more and more, you know, the conversation coming up and being seriously talked about of like your Richard Spencers and people of that ilk are being more taken seriously, I guess. And it's just fascinating learning the history of white and how you go, well, that word doesn't really mean anything per se, because like historically, you know, you look at like you said, Italians were at one point not white. Some of the whitest people you can think of, like Irish people, were at one point not white. And so it's like, well, what do you mean by that? And I think that you already don't have to have very much reflection to get into that sort of mindset. That mindset, there's no kind of like reflection into it.
Well, in us taking, or not me, but people taking someone like, you know, the Richard Spencers of the world seriously is like, of course, like drenched in white supremacy, but there's linguistic reasons for that too, right? Like, he is white. He has a quote unquote standardized way of speaking, right? So he sounds like the newscasters or whatever. He, you know, it's all built around just like so many gross things, so many isms, right? Racism
and also respectability politics. He dresses nicely.
Yeah.
So when we think of the KKK, or we think of like old school racists, they sort of had this, like, in our mind, hick. I'm using that with air quotes. Hick look, and he does not have that. He looks dapper, as I think it was Mother Jones called him. And I think that's part of why he's become more accepted, and that's very problematic. Again, we shouldn't judge people for things that have nothing to do with who they are as a human being. Just because he looks nice does not make him a nice person. Just because someone dresses slovenly does not make them a bad person.
Right. And when we talk to someone from Appalachia, they have to contend with the discrimination that many people feel toward them because of this whole quote unquote hick ideal, or like the hillbillies. What's that show? Like Beverly Hillbillies, whatever. Like that idea is what many people have in their head about people that live in Appalachia. And so we hear someone speak that way. And so we assume maybe that they don't have much money, or that, all the other terrible stereotypes that come to mind just because of the way they speak, so.
Yeah, it is fascinating learning more and more about, because just starting to really get into the weeds in these sort of topics. Here in Idaho, pretty red state. So these are not the kind of topics that were necessarily coming up in school. We weren't talking about these sort of social things. And so I was lucky enough to grow up in a house that was very much, hey, just don't be an asshole to people, be cool. If somebody's doing something and it's not hurting anybody, why do you have to then? And at the same time, also trying to do the most amount of good for people that you possibly can. So I was lucky to grow up parents that were like that. But at the same time, we grew up and still live in a climate that really not that very much. I think I'm still working on learning. I think we all are, but I just find it really interesting how even I hear with I guess political sort of assumptions about people. You can hear about oh, such and such is from Texas, and immediately your brain believe in what they must think. When
it's similar for Arizonans. People think that Arizona is this wasteland of right-wing politics. And I guess for a while, I see why people thought that. But this state is much more varied than it looks on the national stage.
Right.
Yeah, I think the nice thing is we're starting to get more expansion from they're starting to move everywhere else as it gets more expensive. They're starting to kind of blew up the places a lot more too. I know out here, for instance, we've got you've got Nampa and Boise, which are the two big city metropolitan areas in Idaho, and then you've got everywhere else, which is still very, very Republican. But I'm noticing more and more in the Nampa Boise area is starting to really into a much more not quite progressive, definitely not progressive, but more just kind of, I guess is the best way to say it. And that's a weird thing too, the sort of the expansion and how it's starting to change.
I'm sorry, as a linguist, I noticed that you said Boise. Is that how you would pronounce it? I always said Boise.
Yeah, no, and it is. Yeah, it's there's actually a big conversation about that amongst people who live in Boise. That I always grew up saying Boise. Saying it wrong, I don't know, but
no, there's no wrong.
Yeah. But yeah, I believe most people living in the area say Boise. Yeah.
it's interesting that you picked that up because I was going to ask about that too. Because I incorrectly always pronounced it Boise, and I know every time I hear someone from Boise say Boise, it always like triggers something in my brain, and I think, oh, you're right, that's the way you're supposed to say it.
Yeah.
I love place names for that because there's always like the local way to say it and the non-local way.
Yep.
Yeah, like what's like Illinois, I think, is one that a lot of people mess up.
Yeah.
Right now, but yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, here there's a place called Prescott that everyone wants to pronounce Prescott because of the way it's spelled.
I think as you said that, I think my mind insists, oh, that's probably spelled Prescott.
Yep.
So,
yes.
Yeah.
Or there's Spokane.
Oh,
as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna try real hard to say Boise.
Me too.
It's not gonna work.
I know.
I think Boiseans use it as like a tell.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And yeah, it kind of gives you a tip off that someone might not be local.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, that's it's just this and that's why I love shows that's what I love about podcasting in general, is that before podcasting became so, I don't want to say mainstream because it's still not. I think it's still a very niche thing.
Mm-hmm.
Ability to just listen to people do these deep dives into topics that you otherwise would have never really been able to listen to per se. I just got done talking for the last like hour about how amazing the internet is and how much it's changed the way that we all kind of consume information. And it's a great thing, you know. Like before, when I've been able to go, well, I want to learn about how different languages are structured and sort of what we garner from them and how we judge people based off of them. Before the internet, I would have, okay, you can find a book about it.
No, yeah, it's a beautiful thing about podcasts. And I mean, this has been a really quick kind of shift because I remember maybe a year or two ago, before Serial, because I really got into podcasts after Serial, I was like, man, who is this asshole with a podcast? You know, like but then Serial happened and I was like, this is the best. Podcasts are life.
My only gripe with Serial and NPR in general is they have bar a little too high.
I mean, yeah.
I think I saw an article that said something about Serial's website is a great example of what podcast websites should look like.
Oh.
Like, awesome. Yeah, you get me a team of like 20 people.
Yeah.
And I'll have that too. But
no. Yeah.
We don't.
Yeah, BuzzFeed is like is crowdsourcing an indie podcast list. Isn't that right, Carrie? Was it like specifically not really popular ones?
Underrated, I think is what it said.
Underrated.
So I don't think you have to be indie, but probably.
But yeah, I like the idea that, all right, so there are podcasts that exist outside of NPR's
wonderful.
Yes, wonderful. Everything's great. Yes.
But still, yeah.
Yeah.
I think NPR might have been what got me into podcasts as well. I know I jumped on before. That sounds like hipstery, but
I mean,
into it before Serial was cool.
Well, my first one was Savage Love, and that was 2009. So it was many years before Serial. But I didn't like get into it. Like I listened to a few. After Serial, everything blew up. There were just way more options, and I think that's part of why I started listening to more of them.
Mm-hmm.
And they could tell stories. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's what reminded me of it. Was Loveline is where I started.
Oh yeah.
I don't know that one.
They started putting that out as a podcast. It was a radio.
Right?
Well, they had a program for a while, but they used to be, and it's such a shame because they stopped bankrolling it, and so they stopped doing it. But it was Dr. Drew and just some other guy would do like a radio show at night, and with like questions that they had about this was before they started, I think, oh gosh, years ago, I think the show started. So back before you could just look it up, and people would call in with like relationship questions, or like like sex advice and all sorts of stuff like that. My local radio station used to play it, and so when I was way too young to be listening to it, I would listen to it at night, and then I stopped, and I was like, I wonder if they're still doing that, and looked it up, and then found out that they of it, and that's how I got into podcasts.
That's cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's it's interesting how I think I don't like the big players in the podcasting, because I feel like it kind of does, like I said, set that bar really high, a lot of expectations, but at the same time introducing more people to the medium. So kind of that give and take sort of thing about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It brings people into the fold, I think.
So the last thing that I want to do, I kind of want to as we wrap up, I want to ask you guys if listeners like anything that they've heard, if they want to hear more about these topics, or if they want to reach out to you guys doing those things.
Yes, please do that. Listen to us and reach out. We have, of course, the well, Carrie, why don't you do this?
Okay, so you can listen to us at vocalfriespod.fireside.fm. All our episodes are there. Or you can find us on iTunes or Google Play. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, or Tumblr, all at vocalfriespod. So it's all the same.
Awesome.
Yep.
And our email address is vocalfriespod@gmail.com.
Those links will also be in the show notes for this episode to make it a little easier to click instead of having to type all that in.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if you've never heard us before, start with the first one, right? I mean,
it gives you a taste of what we're like.
Yeah, I mean,
bold statement. Not a lot of people, myself included, say listen to the first one. I always say, if you're listening to the show, jumping around, like that's where I started kind of getting the hang of things.
I mean, we've grown a lot, I think, but
we only have 11 episodes under our belt so far. So I guess like there's been growth, but I bet there's going to be more growth later. So I don't feel embarrassed by our first episode. Maybe I will next year. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, I want to thank you guys again for taking time out of your day to come on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Well,
and
thank
I hope
you.
You did as well.
Yeah, I definitely did. Yeah.
It was nice to virtually meet you.
Yes. You too.
All right. Well, hey, you have a good one.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you.
Bye.